Heroin epidemic. In the 1970s, heroin swept across the United States, especially affecting urban areas like New York City. Following the Vietnam War, heroin use spiked as returning soldiers, many of whom had been exposed to the drug overseas, brought it back home. New York City, in particular, saw a surge in heroin-related deaths, crime, and addiction. The drug, derived from morphine, produces an intense euphoria, but its effects are short-lived, leading to repeated use and a downward spiral of addiction. The heroin epidemic of the 1970s also coincided with a rise in organized crime syndicates controlling the distribution of the drug. Cities across the country experienced spikes in violent crime and overdose deaths. Public health officials were ill-equipped to handle the surge, and treatment options were scarce. Methadone programs were introduced, offering a controversial but somewhat effective method of curbing withdrawal symptoms and stabilizing addicts. By the end of the 1970s, the number of heroin addicts in the U.S. was estimated to be between 500,000 and 750,000. The epidemic also contributed to the spread of infectious diseases like HIV and hepatitis C, as many users shared contaminated needles. It was one of the first times that the U.S. was forced to grapple with the dual issues of drug addiction and public health on a large scale. Ecstasy epidemic. Ecstasy, also known as MDMA, became wildly popular in the 1990s, particularly in the rave and nightclub scenes. The drug is a synthetic stimulant with hallucinogenic properties, often taken for its ability to produce feelings of euphoria, emotional closeness, and heightened sensory perception. By the late 1990s, ecstasy was widely used by young people in the US, Europe, and elsewhere. MDMA gained notoriety not only for its pleasurable effects but also for the dangers associated with its use. In high doses, or when combined with prolonged physical activity, as often occurred in nightclubs, MDMA can lead to dehydration, hyperthermia, and in some cases, death. The drug was also often adulterated with other substances, making it even more unpredictable. Governments around the world cracked down on MDMA use, with many countries classifying it as a Schedule I drug. The drug's popularity peaked in the early 2000s, and although its use has declined somewhat, it remains part of the club drug scene today. Some recent research has explored the therapeutic potential of MDMA for conditions like PTSD, but its recreational use still poses significant risks, particularly among adolescents and young adults. LSD epidemic. The LSD epidemic is often associated with the counterculture movement of the 1960s in the United States. Lysergic acid diethylamide, LSD, is a powerful hallucinogen that became popular in part due to its promotion by figures like Timothy Leary, a Harvard professor who encouraged people to experiment with the drug to achieve expanded consciousness. LSD became synonymous with the hippie movement, which valued personal liberation, peace, and spiritual exploration. By the mid-1960s, LSD was being used recreationally at large music festivals like Woodstock, as well as in private settings. Users experienced vivid hallucinations, altered perception of time, and deep introspective thoughts. While some people reported positive experiences, others encountered bad trips that caused paranoia, anxiety, and even long-term psychological effects. As LSD use became more common, concerns about its safety grew. In response, the U.S. government classified LSD as a Schedule I drug in 1967, banning its use and production. Despite this, underground use persisted, and LSD remained a symbol of rebellion throughout the 1970s. Although its popularity has declined since its peak, it laid the foundation for ongoing debates about the therapeutic potential of psychedelics in treating mental health conditions like depression and PTSD. Crack cocaine epidemic. The crack cocaine epidemic of the 1980s and 1990s had a devastating impact on American cities, particularly in marginalized, low-income communities. Crack is a cheaper, more potent, and smokable form of cocaine that became widely available in urban areas. As the demand for crack surged, it led to a dramatic increase in drug-related violence, crime, and incarceration rates. Crack cocaine became popular due to its low cost and intense short-lived high, which quickly led to widespread addiction. The effects of the drug were especially harmful, as users were more prone to aggressive behavior, and addiction occurred rapidly. As crack use spread, so did the violent drug trade that accompanied it. Inner-city neighborhoods saw spikes in homicides and gang-related activity, as drug dealers fought for control over the lucrative crack market. The U.S. government's response was to introduce harsh sentencing laws. Under the Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986, individuals caught with crack cocaine faced much stiffer penalties than those caught with powder cocaine, despite both drugs being nearly identical in chemical composition. This disparity disproportionately affected African American communities, where crack use was more prevalent, leading to mass incarceration that still affects those communities today. Opium epidemic. The opium epidemic. In 19th century China is one of the most devastating drug crises in world history. By the early 1800s, opium, primarily introduced by British traders from India, had become a widespread addiction problem in China. Despite efforts by the Chinese government to limit its use, opium consumption grew at an alarming rate. The demand for the drug was so high that Chinese silver reserves were drained to purchase it, creating economic instability. By the mid-19th century, millions of Chinese citizens, from peasants to the elite, were addicted. The British East India Company was profiting immensely from the trade, leading to increased tensions between China and Britain. These tensions culminated in the Opium Wars, 1839 to 1842 and 1856 to 1860, with China eventually losing and being forced to legalize the opium trade. The Treaty of Nanking, signed after the First Opium War, ceded Hong Kong to Britain and opened several Chinese ports to foreign trade. At its peak, an estimated 12 million people were addicted to opium in China. The epidemic devastated families and communities, contributing to social and economic chaos. It took decades and severe reforms in the 20th century, particularly under the communist regime, for China to effectively control the issue. Fen Cyne epidemic. Fen Cyne, commonly known as PCP or angel dust, became a significant drug problem in the United States during the 1970s. Initially developed as a surgical anesthetic, PCP was soon discontinued for medical use due to its severe side effects, including hallucinations, aggression, and extreme disorientation. Despite its dangers, it found a niche as a recreational drug. PCP was particularly notorious for causing violent and erratic behavior, leading to dangerous confrontations between users and law enforcement. In some cases, users exhibited superhuman strength or seemed impervious to pain, making it difficult for police to subdue them without using excessive force. These incidents contributed to PCP's reputation as one of the most dangerous street drugs of the time. While its popularity waned by the 1980s, PCP never fully disappeared and still shows up in some drug markets today. The drug's legacy continues to influence the public perception of hallucinogens and their potential risks. Amphetamine epidemic. Amphetamines became widely used during World War II to enhance soldier performance by increasing alertness and reducing fatigue. Both Axis and Allied forces used the stimulant, including American, British, German, and Japanese troops. German soldiers were particularly given methamphetamine pills, known as Pervitin, to stay awake during extended periods of combat. Some reports suggest millions of pills were distributed during the war. After the war, the use of amphetamines didn't stop. Instead, it spread into civilian life. The drug was marketed as a weight loss aid and a treatment for depression and lethargy. By the 1950s and 1960s, amphetamines were being prescribed to people across the U.S., leading to widespread misuse. College students and truck drivers in particular used the drug to enhance concentration and stamina. By the 1960s, the U.S. saw a rising number of amphetamine addiction cases. People were abusing the drug, leading to dependency, mental health issues, and physical health complications like heart problems. Eventually, as the dangers became more apparent, regulations tightened in the 1970s, and amphetamines became more controlled substances. The epidemic's legacy is still felt today, with modern stimulants like Adderall continuing to be widely prescribed for medical conditions like ADHD. Barbiturate crisis. Barbiturates, once commonly prescribed as sedatives and sleeping aids, were at the center of a significant drug crisis in the 1960s and 1970s. These drugs, which include phenobarbital and secobarbital, were widely used for their calming effects but also had a high potential for abuse and overdose. By the mid-20th century, doctors prescribed barbiturates for everything from anxiety to insomnia, leading to widespread availability. However, barbiturates are highly addictive, and users quickly build up a tolerance, requiring higher doses to achieve the same effect. This often led to accidental overdoses, especially when combined with alcohol or other depressants. The drug's overdose risk was a major concern, and many famous individuals, including Marilyn Monroe, died as a result of barbiturate poisoning. The dangers of barbiturates eventually led to their decline in medical use. In the 1970s, doctors began prescribing benzodiazepines, like Valium, as a safer alternative. Today, barbiturates are rarely prescribed, and their role in the drug crisis serves as a reminder of the risks of overprescription and dependency associated with sedative medications. Bath salts epidemic. Bath salts refer to synthetic cathinones, a class of psychoactive substances that became widely used in the U.S. in the early 2000s. These drugs were often sold legally in convenience stores and online, marketed as bath salts or plant food to avoid drug regulations. Users took them for their stimulant effects, which could mimic those of cocaine, methamphetamine, or MDMA. However, bath salts were also known for causing dangerous and unpredictable side effects. Users often experienced severe paranoia, hallucinations, violent behavior, and in some cases, extreme psychosis. One of the most famous incidents linked to bath salts involved a man in Florida who, while reportedly under the influence of the drug, attacked another person in a violent and bizarre manner. Such incidents contributed to widespread media attention and public alarm. In response, governments quickly enacted bans and regulations to control the sale and distribution of synthetic cathinones. Although use of bath salts has declined since the early 2010s, they remain a cautionary tale of how synthetic drugs can evade regulation and cause harm before authorities have a chance to respond. Fentanyl crisis. The fentanyl crisis represents one of the most lethal phases of the opioid epidemic in the United States. Fentanyl is a synthetic opioid that is 50 to 100 times more potent than morphine. Originally developed for pain management in cancer patients, it has now become a major contributor to overdose deaths. Starting in the 2010s, fentanyl began to be mixed with other street drugs like heroin, cocaine, and counterfeit pills, often without the user's knowledge. This dramatically increased the risk of overdose. Because of its extreme potency, even small amounts of fentanyl can be deadly. In 2019, more than 36,000 deaths in the U.S. were attributed to synthetic opioids like fentanyl. Drug dealers often use fentanyl because it is cheaper and easier to transport than heroin, but the margin for error in dosing is razor-thin, leading to accidental overdoses at an alarming rate. Efforts to curb the fentanyl crisis include increased access to naloxone, fentanyl test strips, and public awareness campaigns. However, the rapid spread of fentanyl and its analogs continues to overwhelm public health and law enforcement agencies. Its devastating effects have reshaped the landscape of drug addiction and overdose in the U.S., claiming tens of thousands of lives annually. Flaka epidemic. Flaka, also known as alpha-PVP, is a synthetic stimulant that became popular in the United States in the 2010s. Its chemical structure is similar to bath salts, and like those drugs, it was sold legally for a time, often labeled as plant food or research chemicals. Users reported intense feelings of euphoria, but Flaka also led to dangerous side effects, including violent behavior, paranoia, hallucinations, and even death. The drug became infamous for causing bizarre behavior. News stories detailed cases of users running naked through the streets, engaging in violent altercations, or experiencing psychotic episodes. Flaka was particularly prevalent in Florida, where authorities struggled to manage the surge in cases related to its use. One of the most dangerous aspects of Flaka is its potency. Even a small amount can lead to an overdose, causing severe cardiovascular problems or kidney failure. By the mid-2010s, U.S. law enforcement had cracked down on Flaka, leading to a decline in its availability. However, its impact during the height of its popularity showed how quickly new synthetic drugs can cause chaos and harm. Methaqualone epidemic. Methaqualone, commonly known by the brand name Quaalude, was a sedative hypnotic drug that became widely popular in the United States during the 1970s. Initially marketed as a non-addictive alternative to barbiturates, Quaaludes were prescribed for insomnia and anxiety. However, they were highly addictive, and recreational use skyrocketed during the disco era. Quaaludes were often used at parties and nightclubs, where they became associated with the drug culture of the time. The drug's relaxing and euphoric effects made it popular, but its sedative properties also made overdose a significant risk, especially when mixed with alcohol. Users who took too much would experience what was known as looting out, where they became immobilized or incoherent. By the late 1970s, methaqualone abuse had become a major concern, and the U.S. government classified it as a Schedule I drug in 1984, effectively banning its manufacture and sale. Despite its eventual decline in availability, Quaaludes became a cultural symbol of the excesses of the 1970s, and references to their use still appear in popular media. Prescription opioid crisis. The prescription opioid crisis in the United States began in the 1990s when pharmaceutical companies reassured doctors that opioid pain relievers, such as OxyContin, were safe and non-addictive. This led to a sharp increase in prescriptions, and many patients, often unaware of the risks, became addicted. Over time, as prescriptions became harder to obtain, many users turned to cheaper and more accessible alternatives, like heroin and fentanyl. The opioid crisis has had a devastating effect on the U.S., particularly in rural and working-class communities. By 2017, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention reported that more than 47,000 Americans died from opioid overdoses, and the epidemic shows no signs of slowing down. The total economic burden of prescription opioid misuse in the U.S. is estimated to be $78.5 billion annually, including costs related to healthcare, lost productivity, addiction treatment, and criminal justice involvement. Efforts to combat the crisis have included prescribing guidelines, addiction treatment programs, and the distribution of naloxone, an overdose reversal drug. Lawsuits against pharmaceutical companies have also led to multi-billion-dollar settlements, but the path to fully addressing the crisis remains long and complex. Synthetic cannabinoid epidemic. Synthetic cannabinoids, often referred to by street names like Spice or K2, became a significant public health issue in the 2010s. These substances mimic the effects of THC, the active ingredient in marijuana, but are much more potent and unpredictable. Synthetic cannabinoids are typically sprayed onto plant material and sold as a legal alternative to marijuana, often marketed as incense or herbal blends. The appeal of synthetic cannabinoids lies in their accessibility and the fact that they didn't show up on traditional drug tests for some time. However, the chemicals used in these products are often dangerous and lead to severe side effects. Users reported symptoms ranging from hallucinations and extreme paranoia to violent behavior and seizures. The effects were so erratic that emergency rooms saw an uptick in cases related to synthetic cannabinoid use. By 2015, thousands of people were hospitalized due to these drugs, and there were multiple reports of fatalities. Law enforcement agencies and public health officials have since cracked down on the sale of synthetic cannabinoids, but their ever-changing chemical formulas make regulation difficult. The epidemic highlighted the risks of unregulated synthetic drugs and their potential for widespread harm. Methamphetamine epidemic. Methamphetamine, or meth, is a synthetic stimulant that has had a significant impact on American communities since the 2000s. The meth epidemic is especially severe in rural areas, where access to other stimulants, like cocaine, is limited. Meth is relatively easy and inexpensive to manufacture, and many meth labs have been uncovered in small towns across the Midwest and South. The effects of meth on the body are extreme, leading to heightened alertness, energy, and euphoria. However, long-term use causes severe physical and psychological damage. Users often experience extreme weight loss, dental decay, referred to as meth mouth, and intense paranoia. Meth is also incredibly addictive, and users can develop a dependency quickly. In the early 2000s, law enforcement cracked down on the domestic production of meth by regulating access to key ingredients, such as pseudoephedrine. However, this only shifted production to large-scale operations in Mexico, where meth is now produced in purer and more potent forms. In recent years, meth overdoses have risen sharply, often compounded by the presence of fentanyl in the drug supply. The meth epidemic continues to strain public health systems, law enforcement, and families across the country.